It's easy to forget just how new MMA is, from a modern day perspective that is. While the basics have been worked out, there's still a lot of new ground to be broken. In contrast, modern day boxing has been around since long before the creation of film, and in fact, was one of the first things ever put to film. And in its earlier form, it shared far more similarities to MMA, with light gloves and an emphasis on wrestling techniques. So let's take a look at some amazing boxers that all MMA practitioners should study. The first is the legendary Henry Armstrong. In the days when there were only 8 weight classes, Henry Armstrong held championship belts in 3 of them at the same time. Armstrong gave literal meaning to the term, use your head. He used low-line head movement to enter into exchanges and then blended that movement into wrestling techniques to control his opponent's posture. Watch how Armstrong weaves from shoulder to shoulder and hip to hip, evading punches, pinning his opponent's arms, setting up counters, and knocking his competitors off balance. Wrestlers are taught how to control their opponents by applying pressure with their heads, but where mixed martial artists can really benefit from watching Armstrong was how to set this pressure up. Armstrong blended defensive head movement into offensive head pressure. It's pretty easy to see how Armstrong's head movement could easily transition into takedowns. Note how both Armstrong and Khabib bend at the waist to weave while throwing. Nonetheless, the results speak for themselves. But another factor to consider is how Armstrong's head movement left his opponents guessing, questioning if he would use the change in head slot to load a gazelle hook, as seen here, ease in an overhand, like here, or ram into his opponent, as seen here. In MMA terms, this would leave an opponent guessing between defending a hook, overhand, and takedown. While low-line head movement is a terrible idea in kickboxing or Muay Thai due to knees and kicks, it becomes beneficial once again in MMA because of the ability to threaten or set up takedowns. And all in all, weaves in MMA are proving more effective against knees and uppercuts than many thought possible. The trick to not ending up like Ben Askren is to set up your takedowns with feints and head movement. Moving on. The next fighter may surprise some viewers new to my channel, George Foreman. Aside from being heavyweight champion and one of the greatest power punchers of all time, Foreman was amazing at manipulating his opponent's guard and posture. Hand fighting is a common skill in wrestling, and Foreman employed it masterfully in boxing. He used an extended guard to probe, disturb, pin, leverage block, and clear his opponent's hands. Prodding his opponent's rear hand made way for his right, and set up collar ties, while probing his lead hand made way for his left. In this way, he could create openings and pull opponents into punches. And lastly, Foreman used something so simple that is only now making an appearance in MMA. He simply pushed his opponents off balance. Check out Cejudo vs Dillashaw to see what a surprisingly big impact a simple shove can make. Or any sumo wrestling match ever, I guess. An alternative to studying Foreman for these tactics would be Jack Johnson, although he more often used these tactics to tire his opponents than to set up power shots. The next boxer all mixed martial artists should study is Roberto Duran, aptly referred to as the Hands of Stone. Duran is perhaps the greatest infighter of all time. From close range, he deftly manipulated his opponent's guard to create openings and lead them into punches. And he did all of this with boxing gloves on. Along with using his head to pressure his opponents against the ropes like Armstrong, Duran disturbed his opponent's balance through underhooks, overhooks, wrist control, and collar ties. Rather than rely on head movement, Duran often entered into exchanges by throwing his right to clear away his opponent's guard, and then turned that same punch into an overhook. Once at this preferred range, Duran went to work creating openings. By cranking his opponent's arms, Duran tilted them off balance, thus opening up their midsections, much as you see John Jones do here. He also controlled his opponent's wrists to create openings, pulling them down, or pinning them, and employed collar ties to lead them into body shots. As a bonus, check out Duran's extremely close-range uppercut. This is an attack any mixed martial artist would be happy to have in their repertoire when up against the cage. One of the first MMA fighters to have success with these techniques was Randy Couture, but others like DC and John Jones also use these same dirty boxing tactics all the time. So far we've looked at Armstrong, who is great at blending head movement with head control, Foreman, who is great at manipulating his opponent's defense and posture with an extended guard, and Duran, who is a true master at using grappling to dominate in fighting. So lastly, let's look at a fighter who was incredible at dominating with footwork, and has already been stated as an influence by some of the best mixed martial artists ever. I'm speaking, of course, about Willie Pep. Pep's footwork was otherworldly, and he expertly transitioned between orthodox, southpaw, and squared up neutral stances as he danced around his opponents. There's a lot of reasons why being multi-stance seems to work better in MMA than boxing, from foot positioning of single versus double leg takedowns, to switching which leg is the power leg. But Pep can provide any mixed martial artist with a blueprint for seamless stance switching, regardless of what they're trying to set up. Pep transitioned between all of these stances and positions using a pendulum step, basically shuffling his feet together and then back apart. The trick was that once his feet were together, his opponent never knew which way he was going to step out. He could step out laterally to evade his opponent, shift back at an angle to change which hand was his power hand, or V-step to suddenly switch places with the competitor. To see some of Pep's footwork in action, check out Dominic Cruz and Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. And finally, we're going to end the breakdown with some boxers that could theoretically have useful techniques in MMA. Boxers whose techniques have been used a handful of times and have worked really well the few times they have been. These would be boxers who use cross guards, like Archie Moore, and the Philly shell, like Floyd Mayweather. In MMA, Yoel Romero has used the cross guard successfully several times. And the same can be said for Poirier and the Philly shell. There are some definite benefits. Keeping your hands in a cross position leaves them already halfway to parrying kicks, and having at least one hand lower can make it easier to defend takedowns by securing an underhook. Also, catching punches on your elbows has a far more likely chance of damaging an opponent's hands due to MMA's much smaller gloves. But once again, this is still all theoretical, and time will tell if these systems were actually viable for MMA or just happened to fit the fighters who use them. You can let everyone know in the comments below what you think about the topic, and any other boxers or kickboxers who would be great for mixed martial artists to study. If you would like to learn more about these techniques, you can check out my books on power and footwork, or pre-order Aggressive Defense, out soon. Also, you can check out our new 100-page fight comic, Mortal Weapons. For the Modern Martial Artist, this has been David Christian, wishing you happy training.